This is my true story. I worked my whole life to raise a family that I thought would take care of me when I was old. I gave them everything: money, comfort, and my time. But one morning, they told me I needed more care and drove me to a nursing home. They said it was temporary. It wasn't. They left me there and never called again. I cried the first week, but after that, I stopped waiting. 3 months later, when they finally walked through the door, I wasn't a patient anymore. I was the new director. Before that, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. The day they dropped me off is still clear in my mind. My son drove the car while my daughter-in-law sat in the front, pretending to comfort me with soft words that meant nothing. They said it was just for a few weeks, that the nursing home would help me recover from the flu I had and make sure I was eating right. I believed them because I wanted to. I thought my family loved me enough to mean what they said. When we arrived, my son carried my suitcase into the lobby, signed a few papers, and told the receptionist he would call in a few days to check on me. He never did. They hugged me quickly, not even looking me in the eyes, and walked out together. I stood at the window and watched the car drive away until it disappeared around the corner. I waited for it to come back that night, thinking maybe they had forgotten something, but it didn't. Days passed, and no one called. The staff brought me meals, asked about my health, and treated me kindly, but kindness from strangers feels different from love. I tried to keep busy, talking to other residents, helping the nurses with small things, folding laundry, tidying rooms, anything to keep my mind off the silence. The phone in the hallway rang for others, but not for me. I began to understand that I wasn't here temporarily. I had been placed, stored, and forgotten like old furniture in storage. Weeks turned into months. I marked the days on a small calendar the nurse gave me. Every Sunday I told myself they would visit. Every Sunday ended the same way, with quiet hallways and empty chairs. I learned the routine of the place: breakfast at 7, medicine at 8, exercise at 10, lunch at noon, visiting hours at 4. I would sit near the door every afternoon, watching other families come in, bringing flowers, cake, or hugs. I smiled for them even when my heart ached. The nurses began to notice that I wasn't like the others. I didn't complain, I didn't cry, and I didn't depend on anyone. I cleaned my own room, folded my sheets neatly, helped the others who couldn't move as easily. The head nurse, a kind woman named Judith, told me once, "You're the only one here who keeps things running on time." I thanked her but didn't say what I was thinking, that keeping busy was the only way to keep from falling apart. The staff slowly began trusting me with small responsibilities. They asked me to help organize patient schedules, check supply lists, and remind others of appointments. It gave me something to do, something that made me feel useful again. But at night, when the halls were dark and quiet, the sadness returned. I thought about my home, about the pictures on the walls, about the dinner table I had cleaned 1,000 times, about the laughter that used to fill that house. I wondered if they had already packed away my things, if someone else was living there now. I wondered if my grandchildren even asked where I was. I realized then that I wasn't just forgotten. I was replaced. Still, something inside me refused to stay broken. I decided if I was going to live here, I would make the best of it. I wasn't going to let their betrayal turn me into a victim. I started watching how the place worked, how staff talked to management, how reports were filed, how systems failed when people didn't pay attention. I began keeping notes. Not out of habit, but out of instinct. I had managed offices before, run entire departments, and trained staff younger than half the people here. I knew what organization looked like, and this place was running on borrowed patience. I started planning quietly. I made suggestions to the head nurse, fixed charts, and rearranged task boards to make them more efficient. The improvements didn't go unnoticed. Within a few weeks, the operations became smoother, and the staff started treating me less like a resident and more like part of the team. I was slowly changing the very place they had abandoned me in. Every improvement, every compliment, every system that worked better than before reminded me that being forgotten didn't mean being finished. They had left me here thinking they were putting an end to my story, but all they really did was give me a new beginning. The days turned into a steady rhythm, and I made that rhythm my strength. I woke up before everyone else, just as the sun began to rise through the thin curtains of my small room. While most residents waited for the nurses to help them start their mornings, I was already dressed and tidying up the common area. I picked up newspapers, straightened chairs, and set up breakfast trays before anyone asked. The staff got used to seeing me early, and they began to rely on me. I reminded them who needed their medicine and who had appointments that day. I noticed what was missing from supply closets and wrote it down before they ran out. At first, they laughed and called me the volunteer, but soon they stopped laughing and started asking for my help seriously. I didn't mind. It gave me purpose. I knew what it meant to manage people, to build systems, to make things run smoothly. I had done it all my life, at home, at work, and now here. Within a few weeks, I had memorized the schedules better than the staff. I knew which doctor visited on which day, which patient preferred tea instead of coffee, and which supplier always delivered late. I kept track of everything in a small notebook the head nurse gave me. The nurses would often ask, "Did we already restock room 7?" or "Who has physical therapy at 2?" And I would have the answer before they checked the computer. They started depending on me more than they admitted. One afternoon, when a delivery truck came early and no one was ready, I took charge. I organized the unloading, signed the receipt, and filed the papers before the manager even knew the supplies had arrived. When she walked in later and saw everything neatly done, she looked surprised. She asked who handled it. The head nurse pointed to me. From that day forward, I was no longer just a resident. I was part of the operation. The residents noticed the change, too. They started coming to me for help instead of waiting for the staff. I read letters for those who couldn't see well, wrote messages for those whose hands trembled, and kept track of who needed what. I found peace in being useful again. Every small task felt like a quiet victory against the loneliness my family left me with. The more I worked, the less I thought about them. I learned every inch of that building, the offices, the storage rooms, the administrative corridors where most residents never went. I talked to the maintenance staff and learned how the systems worked. When the head nurse saw my efficiency, she began giving me actual responsibilities. I organized medicine charts, rewrote duty rosters, and even suggested a few ways to reduce wasted supplies. My suggestions were implemented. The difference was noticeable within a week. Fewer mistakes, fewer complaints, smoother operations. It didn't surprise me. I had always been good at fixing things. What did surprise me was how much I enjoyed it. The job filled a space that my family's absence had left behind. I started eating meals with the staff instead of alone in my room. I joined the team meetings and spoke when asked. They respected me because I earned it. No one saw me as a burden anymore. The same woman who had been left in a nursing home like she didn't matter was now the person others turned to for guidance. Every evening when I walked through the halls, I looked at the faces of residents and staff and felt something I hadn't felt in months: pride. I was making something out of the place meant to be my ending. I had found a new rhythm, and it worked. The head nurse even joked that I ran the place better than management. I smiled but didn't argue. She was right. I was building something, slowly, quietly, with patience. The same people who had left me behind would have no idea that their castaway had become the spine of this facility, and deep inside I was beginning to understand something important. They had abandoned me to get rid of responsibility, but they had accidentally freed me to reclaim my power. It was an ordinary morning when the opportunity appeared. I was in the office sorting through medication charts when a man in a suit walked in with the regional corporate badge on his jacket. He was inspecting the facility after the former director had retired. Most staff looked nervous around him, but I didn't. I had worked under people like him before, the kind who measure performance by paperwork rather than presence. He started asking questions about scheduling, patient satisfaction, and efficiency. The staff stumbled through answers, flipping through files and checking notes. I quietly handed him the weekly report I had prepared for the nurses. He looked at it, surprised by the neat handwriting, clear organization, and accuracy. "Who put this together?" he asked. The head nurse pointed at me. "She's a resident," she said, "but she keeps this place running." He looked back at me with raised eyebrows, half impressed, half confused. "You live here?" he asked. I nodded and told him I'd moved in a few months ago. That answer made him curious. He began asking about my background, so I explained that I had spent most of my career in administration and management. I had overseen teams, managed budgets, and coordinated operations for years before retiring. He asked why I was here, and I simply said, "Family thought I needed rest." He didn't ask more, but I could see in his eyes that he understood. He started walking through the facility with me, asking questions about operations, and I answered them all clearly. I showed him where resources were wasted, which shifts overlapped unnecessarily, and how a few policy changes could make the place more efficient. The more I spoke, the more interested he became. By the time the tour was over, he was taking notes himself. Before leaving, he handed me his card and said, "If you're interested, we might need someone with your skill set." I smiled and told him I would think about it. After he left, the staff gathered around me asking what he had said. I shrugged and said nothing. That night, I sat by my window and thought about it for hours. I hadn't felt needed by my own family, but here I was, being recognized by strangers for the same qualities my children had ignored. A week later, the corporate office called and asked me to come in for a formal discussion. They were hiring a new director for the home since the previous one's retirement had left a vacancy. I was one of the names being considered. The irony didn't escape me. I was still technically a resident, yet I was about to apply to manage the entire facility. When I went for the interview, the panel consisted of 3 regional officers. They asked about my experience, my approach to management, and how I would improve the home. I answered each question with confidence. It wasn't hard. Everything they asked about were problems I had already fixed in silence. They nodded, took notes, and thanked me. I didn't expect anything to come of it, but 2 weeks later, I received a call. The job was mine if I wanted it. I accepted without hesitation. The corporate team arranged everything: paperwork, transition, and a new office. My residency status changed from patient to director. The staff celebrated quietly, proud that someone from inside had earned the position. The residents were happy too, knowing one of their own would now lead the place with understanding and respect. I moved into the director's quarters upstairs, and they placed a new brass nameplate on the door. Director, Mrs. The first day I sat behind that desk, I looked around and realized I had turned my abandonment into authority. The same building my family left me in was now under my control. I didn't plan revenge, but I knew fate wasn't done yet. I didn't call my family. I didn't send letters or news. I waited quietly, working harder than ever, improving every aspect of the home. Because deep inside, I knew one day they would return, not out of love, but out of need. And when they did, I would be ready to meet them from the other side of the desk. After becoming the director, the silence from my family grew louder than ever. Not a single call, message, or letter. 3 months had passed since they left me there, and in all that time, they hadn't even checked if I was alive. They had no idea what had changed, no clue that the same woman they abandoned now signed their paychecks if they ever wanted to work here. I stopped expecting anything from them. At first, I kept my phone nearby, glancing at it every evening as if maybe they'd remember my birthday. Maybe a simple text saying, "How are you, Mom?" would come through. It never did. Birthdays came and went, holidays too. I saw other residents smiling during visiting hours, holding hands with their families, crying tears of joy when they saw their grandchildren. I stayed in my office during those hours, signing papers and approving budgets, pretending the noise didn't bother me. I told myself I was too busy to care, but I did care. I just refused to show it. Every time my office phone rang, I hoped it might be one of them, but it was always business. Suppliers, staff schedules, inspections, or local organizations asking for collaborations. My personal phone, the one that used to buzz all the time with family messages, stayed cold and silent. I learned how to live with that quiet. It became the background to my days, the thing that reminded me not to make the same mistake twice. I had given my family too much control over my happiness, and now I had taken it back. The nurses treated me with respect, the staff admired my discipline, and the residents looked at me with gratitude. I had built something meaningful out of what was supposed to be my ending. I turned that silence into fuel. Whenever loneliness tried to crawl back in, I worked harder. I improved the programs, renovated the activity rooms, expanded the dining hall, and raised staff wages. The home was thriving, and every success made me stronger. The irony was sharp. My family thought they'd put me in a corner to fade away quietly, but instead, I became the person everyone depended on. Sometimes I wondered what they told people when others asked about me. Did they say I was in a home because I couldn't manage anymore? Did they lie to cover the guilt of what they had done? It didn't matter. The truth was sitting in front of my desk every morning in the form of files, reports, and a growing reputation. I had made the home better than ever before. The board noticed it too. Donations increased, community partnerships grew, and even local officials came to tour the improvements. One of them said, "You've turned this place into something special." I smiled and replied, "It's easy to rebuild when you've lost everything once." They didn't understand the meaning behind that sentence, but I did. Even with all that progress, I couldn't shake the ache completely. Late at night, when the halls were quiet and the lights dimmed, I sometimes walked through the corridors and paused by the residents' rooms. Some of them still waited for families who would never come. Their hope made me sad, but it also made me firm. I had already lived that waiting game and lost. I wasn't waiting anymore. I stopped keeping track of days since their last call. Instead, I counted how many lives I had made better here. That became my new measurement of time. I had earned my peace, but deep inside, I knew they would come back one day. Not because they missed me, but because life has a way of circling back when you least expect it. They would return, maybe desperate, maybe pretending to care, maybe needing something from the very place they left me in. And when that day came, I wouldn't be sitting in a chair by the window anymore. I would be sitting behind my desk, the one with my nameplate, the one they never thought I'd have, ready to show them that abandonment doesn't end a life. It just rewrites it. The day the announcement went public, the atmosphere inside the home felt different. The corporate office had sent out the press release early that morning, confirming the new appointment. Director, Mrs., former resident. The title felt heavy, but right. The staff congratulated me with small smiles, pats on the shoulder, and kind words. The residents were proud too. They said I gave them hope, that maybe their lives weren't finished yet either. I didn't say much in response. I just thanked them and went back to work. Later that afternoon, the announcement was posted on the home's bulletin board right near the entrance, where families usually stop first during visits. It had my name printed in bold letters, with a photo the corporate team had taken of me sitting at my new desk. They also sent the same article to a local paper. The story ran the next day under the headline, "From Resident to Director, a story of leadership and second chances." I read it once quietly and then framed it. I hung it right behind my desk, perfectly centered. It wasn't about showing off. It was about claiming what I had earned. I didn't tell anyone outside the home. No calls, no messages, no updates to my family. I wanted them to find out naturally, maybe through someone who knew someone who read the paper. The thought of them seeing my picture and realizing what I'd become made me smile for the first time in a long time. For years, they had seen me as a burden, a woman whose only use was to support them until she was too old to matter. Now the same woman they abandoned was running an entire organization. The irony was perfect, but I didn't gloat. I just kept working. I focused on improving everything. The home got new furniture, a better kitchen system, and an upgraded recreation wing. We hired more qualified staff and built better training programs. Slowly, our reputation grew, and soon other facilities began contacting us to learn from what we had built. The corporate team was thrilled. They said my management model was practical, efficient, and compassionate. I took pride in that, not for the recognition, but for proving that even after being thrown away, I could still rebuild something valuable. A few days later, a small local TV crew visited to do a short feature on the story. They filmed me walking through the halls, talking to residents, helping with meal distribution, and reviewing documents in my office. They asked how I felt about being both a former resident and now the director. I said, "It gives me perspective. I know how it feels to be on both sides of the door." The segment aired that evening, and though I didn't say a word to my family, I had a feeling they saw it. Small towns never keep secrets for long. By the end of the week, the front desk received dozens of calls from people wanting to congratulate me or donate to the home. Among those calls was one I recognized, my son's number. The receptionist said a man had called asking if the new director was really his mother. She told him, "Yes, she's doing a wonderful job." She said he didn't respond for a few seconds and then hung up. When she told me that story, I just nodded and smiled faintly. That silence on his end said more than any apology ever could. That weekend, I held a small staff meeting to thank everyone for their hard work. After it ended, I sat alone in my office and stared at the framed article behind me. I thought about everything that led to this moment: the betrayal, the quiet months, the effort it took to rebuild. I realized something that night. Power doesn't always come from position, it comes from persistence. They had left me to fade away quietly, but I had turned that silence into my strength. And somewhere out there, my family was finally realizing what they had thrown away. The announcement wasn't just a title change, it was a message written in black ink for the whole town to see. A message that said I was still here, stronger than ever, and this time I didn't need anyone's permission to exist. It was a quiet Thursday morning when the receptionist knocked on my office door and said, "Mrs. last name, there are 3 people here for the job fair interviews." I nodded and told her to send their names to my assistant. She handed me the list, and my eyes stopped at the second line. The names were familiar: my son, his wife, my daughter. For a moment, I just stared at the paper. It felt like time had folded in half. The same people who left me here months ago, the same voices that once said, "It's better this way, Mom," were now outside waiting for a job interview. My heart didn't race, it didn't ache, it just felt steady. I thanked the receptionist, folded the paper, and said calmly, "Send them to my office when their turn comes." She smiled politely, unaware of what she had just handed me. When she left, I sat back in my chair and looked around my office. My nameplate glowed under the soft light. The framed article about my promotion hung perfectly behind me. I straightened the folders on my desk and fixed my posture. I wasn't the woman they left behind anymore. I was the woman they were about to meet again, in a place they never expected. The interviews continued through the morning. I spoke to a few applicants about nursing positions and administrative roles, nodding and offering them polite advice. But every minute that passed felt like I was counting down to a storm that would arrive quietly. When my assistant came in at noon and said, "Your next appointment is a family of 3 here for caregiver positions," I said, "Send them in." I stood up, adjusted my jacket, and waited. I heard laughter in the hallway, familiar laughter. They walked in smiling, still in their polished clothes, holding neatly printed resumes. My son wore a tie, his wife carried a folder, and my daughter had her hair tied up like she used to do when she meant business. They didn't look at me at first. They were too busy greeting my assistant. But the second they stepped into the office and saw me standing behind the desk, everything stopped. My son's smile froze halfway. My daughter's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His wife looked from me to the nameplate and back again, disbelief all over her face. I didn't move for a few seconds. I wanted the silence to stretch long enough for the reality to sink in. Finally, I said, "Good afternoon. Please, have a seat." My tone was professional, polite, calm. My son's voice cracked when he said, "Mom?" I looked directly at him and replied, "Mrs., please." The room went still again. They sat down slowly, eyes wide, no one speaking. I opened their files, glanced at their resumes, and said, "I see you're applying for caregiver positions here at the home." Interesting choice. None of them responded. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands. "Before we start, I want to make sure I understand. You're interested in working with the elderly, correct?" They nodded silently. "That's good," I said. "It's a rewarding job. Requires patience, responsibility, and compassion. Qualities that can't be taught easily." I watched their faces shift, guilt mixing with realization. My daughter tried to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Please," I said, "let's keep this professional." The air in the room was heavy. My son looked at the floor. His wife blinked fast, trying not to cry. My daughter fidgeted with the edge of her folder. I turned to the first page of their applications and began reading out loud. Previous experience, none. Volunteer work, none. References, family. I paused for a moment, then looked up. "Family references can be unreliable," I said evenly. The silence after that sentence was louder than any argument we ever had. I continued the interview as if nothing was strange. I asked questions about their work ethic, about how they handle responsibility, about what made them want to apply here. Every answer was soft, hesitant, unsure. They couldn't look me in the eye. They came here expecting a job. Instead, they were facing the person they left behind, sitting in the chair they thought I'd never reach. When the interview ended, I closed their files and said, "Thank you for coming. We'll review your applications and get back to you." None of them stood up right away. They just sat there, still processing the moment. I smiled faintly and said, "Have a nice day." My assistant opened the door. They walked out slowly, heads down, the same way they walked away from me months ago, except this time, it wasn't me being left behind. The moment they walked into my office will stay with me forever. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, slow, and heavy, like time itself had stopped moving. My son stepped through the doorway first, confident, smiling, ready to charm his way through what he thought was a simple interview. His wife followed close behind, clutching a folder, and my daughter walked last, her eyes scanning the room without realizing where she was. Then their eyes met mine. Every smile disappeared. My son froze mid-step, his face changing from confidence to disbelief in seconds. My daughter's folder slipped from her hand and hit the floor. His wife tried to speak, but no sound came out. I stood behind my desk, calm, still, and steady, watching their faces as the truth settled in. For a few seconds, no one said a word. It was the kind of silence that speaks louder than shouting ever could. They were looking at the person they had abandoned, the one they had forgotten, sitting in the chair they never thought I would reach. I could see the recognition hit them like a wave, followed by shame. I didn't rush to speak. I wanted them to feel every second of that moment. Finally, my son managed to whisper, "Mom?" His voice cracked on the word. I didn't answer right away. I picked up my pen, adjusted a file, and then looked him straight in the eyes. "Mrs. Last name, please," I said, my tone calm and professional. He blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing as if he couldn't process what was happening. My daughter stared at me with tears forming, and his wife reached for her hand under the table. I motioned for them to sit down. They obeyed, still silent. I watched as they sank into the chairs across from me, the same ones where staff usually sit during evaluations. My desk separated us like a wall, the same kind of wall they built between us when they left me in this place months ago. I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands, and simply looked at them. They couldn't meet my gaze for long. My son tried to speak again, starting with, "We didn't know," but I cut him off gently. "I'm sure you didn't," I said, "but let's keep this professional. You're here for an interview after all." That sentence seemed to drain the color from their faces. His wife's eyes darted toward the door, like she wanted to leave but didn't know how. My daughter's lips trembled. My son swallowed hard, his confidence gone. I opened the folder containing their resumes and read the first line out loud. Applicant, son's name. Applying for position, caregiver. I looked up slowly and asked, "You want to work in elder care?" He nodded weakly. "Interesting," I said, closing the folder. "Tell me, how do you approach caring for someone who depends on you?" His throat moved, but no words came out. My daughter's eyes filled with tears again, and I could see the weight of her guilt pressing down harder with every second. I asked his wife next, "What experience do you have in managing senior patients?" She looked at me, shaking her head slightly, whispering, "None." I smiled politely. "That's all right. Experience can be learned. Compassion, however, can't." The silence that followed that sentence was thick and uncomfortable. No one looked up. My son rubbed his hands together nervously, my daughter stared at her lap, and his wife sat perfectly still. I didn't need to say much more. The situation spoke for itself. They were in front of the person they had thrown away, asking for a chance, not realizing how far the tables had turned. I could have humiliated them, shouted, or reminded them of what they did, but I didn't. I stayed calm. Dignity was the best revenge I could give. After a few more minutes, I closed the folders, stacked them neatly, and said, "Thank you for your time. The management team will review your applications and get back to you." They didn't move right away. My son looked like he wanted to say something, but he couldn't find the words. I simply nodded toward the door. My assistant came in and led them out. I watched them go without a single word of anger. When the door closed, I sat back and let the silence return. That moment wasn't about winning or revenge. It was about balance. They had left me in a place they thought was beneath me, and I had turned it into my kingdom. When they sat across from me, the air in the room felt so still that even the ticking of the clock on the wall sounded loud. I opened their folders one by one, taking my time. My son tried to compose himself, but his hands wouldn't stay still. His wife sat stiff, eyes red, pretending to be calm, and my daughter looked completely lost. I could see the regret sitting on their faces, but I didn't rush. I wanted them to remember this moment forever. I began by reading my son's resume aloud. It was simple, nothing special, the kind of document people put together when they're desperate for a job. "You're applying for a caregiver position," I said, my voice steady, almost gentle. He nodded, staring at the floor. "Do you have any experience taking care of elderly people?" He hesitated before shaking his head. "Not really," he said quietly. I nodded and turned to my daughter-in-law's file. "And you?" I asked. She swallowed hard and said, "No, ma'am." I looked at her directly and replied, "Please, it's Mrs." She nodded without speaking again. My daughter's hands trembled slightly when I picked up her folder. "And you're applying for administrative work?" She nodded. "Yes," she whispered. I helped my brother with some paperwork at his business. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my tone neutral. Did that business succeed? The silence said everything. I placed all 3 folders on the desk, aligned them neatly, and said, working here requires more than just skill. It requires patience, compassion, and consistency. It means caring for people who have no one else, people who've been forgotten. I paused deliberately before adding, sometimes by their own families. None of them looked up. My son's shoulders slumped forward. My daughter's chin quivered as she stared at her lap. His wife blinked fast, her face turning pale. I continued, "This isn't just a job. It's a commitment. The kind of commitment that doesn't disappear when things get inconvenient." Every word landed exactly where I wanted it to. They knew I wasn't talking about the position anymore. I was talking about them. I could feel the guilt thick in the room, filling every corner until it was almost hard to breathe. My son tried to speak finally. "Mom," he began, but I interrupted him softly. "Mrs., please. This is a professional setting." His eyes watered. He nodded slowly. "Yes, Mrs." I turned back to the files, flipping through their references. All of them listed each other. I couldn't help but shake my head slightly. I said, references are supposed to vouch for your character. I'm not sure this approach will help you much." My daughter looked like she wanted to vanish. I asked one more question, directed at all 3. If an elderly resident asked you why you wanted this job, what would you tell them? My son hesitated, glancing at his wife for help. We just need work," he said finally. I nodded, closing the folder slowly. "Honesty is good," I said, "but in this line of work, sincerity matters more than survival. When you work with people who've lost everything, you have to remember that you're their last bit of dignity. That's not something to take lightly." They all sat there frozen, speechless. I could tell they were replaying every moment of the past in their heads, every excuse, every time they said they were too busy to visit, every time they justified leaving me here. I stood up and walked around the desk. My steps were slow, steady, deliberate. I leaned against the corner of the desk, arms crossed. "When I came here," I said, "I was told it was temporary. My family promised to call, to visit, to check on me. They never did. So I built something of my own instead." My son's eyes lifted to meet mine, full of tears now. "I'm sorry," he said softly. I didn't respond. Apologies meant nothing when they came this late. I pushed the folders together and handed them to my assistant, who had walked in quietly. "Please file these under pending," I said. Then I looked at my family again and smiled faintly. "Thank you for coming in today. We'll keep your applications on record." My assistant held the door open. None of them moved at first. Finally they stood, avoiding my eyes. My son whispered something to his wife, and they left the room without another word. I watched them go, their footsteps fading down the hallway. For months I had wondered what I would say if I ever saw them again. Now I knew the answer. Nothing. Sometimes silence says more than any speech ever could. After they left my office, the silence stayed for a while, thick and unmoving. I sat at my desk and stared at the 3 folders stacked neatly in front of me. I had seen hundreds of applicants in my career, but none like them. I waited an hour before calling my assistant back in. I told her to mark their applications as reviewed and rejected. She looked surprised but didn't question it. "Yes, Mrs.," she said softly. I knew it would travel fast. News in this place always did. By the next morning, the whispers had already begun. The residents talked about how the director's family had come in looking for work. The staff repeated pieces of the story in the break room. I didn't add or correct anything. I didn't need to. Truth doesn't need defending when it's that clear. Around lunchtime, my receptionist told me that my son had called twice asking to speak with me. I told her to take a message. He called again later, but I didn't answer. The following day, his wife came to the front desk pretending she wanted to drop off some papers. Security informed her I wasn't available. She left without a word. The same woman who once said, "Mom should be grateful we found her a place," now stood outside that same place begging for attention. 2 days later, I had my assistant print a formal rejection letter addressed to all 3 of them. It was polite, professional, and cold. "Thank you for your interest in the caregiver and administrative positions at our facility. After reviewing your applications, we have decided to move forward with other candidates. We wish you the best in your future endeavors." I signed each letter with my full name and title, Director. It felt right. It wasn't anger or vengeance anymore. It was closure. I had worked too hard, lived too long, and endured too much to let guilt weaken that decision. They had left me in this place like I was a burden, and now they were the ones standing on the other side of the door, powerless. Later that afternoon, my head nurse came in and asked gently, "Was that your family, ma'am?" I nodded. "They were," I said simply. "Now they're just applicants." She nodded back slowly and said, "They'll remember this day." I replied, "That's the point." The following week, a staff meeting was held, and I noticed how the atmosphere shifted when I walked in. Everyone knew the story by then, but no one dared to mention it out loud. They looked at me differently, not with pity, but with respect. Even the residents smiled when I passed by, whispering my name like it meant something more now. My family didn't show up again for weeks. Then one morning, the security guard informed me they were outside the gate waiting. I told him to let them wait. They waited for an hour before leaving. They didn't come back after that. I could have met them, could have explained why I did what I did, but I didn't owe them anything. Some lessons have to sting to stay remembered. I had spent my entire life teaching them love and kindness. Maybe now they would learn boundaries and consequence. One evening, after everyone left, I sat alone in my office and looked around. The light was soft, the air smelled faintly of lavender, and everything was still. I thought about the day they dropped me here, how quickly they drove off, how small I felt standing at the window watching their car disappear. I thought about the nights when I couldn't sleep because I kept waiting for a call that never came. I thought about the birthdays they forgot, the messages they ignored, the way they turned me into a responsibility instead of a person. And now, seeing how it had all turned, I realized something. Revenge wasn't the goal. It was dignity. Getting back what they took, my self-respect. When I finally stood up to leave, I placed their folders in a locked cabinet and turned off the light. They were part of my history now, not my future. I walked down the hallway slowly, past the rooms of residents who called me ma'am, and smiled when I greeted them. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt free. They left me in a nursing home without a second thought, believing they were done with me, believing I would sit quietly and fade into the background while they moved on with their lives. They thought I would be another forgotten parent, another quiet name signed on some paperwork, waiting for calls that never came. But life has a way of turning its tables slowly and perfectly. The same place they left me to wither became the place I rose from. I didn't rise through luck or pity. I rose through consistency, patience, and quiet dignity. Every morning I woke up and decided not to be bitter, just better. I treated every nurse, every patient, every visitor with respect, even when my heart was broken. I worked harder than I needed to, not to prove anything to them, but to remind myself that my story wasn't over yet. When the opportunity came to lead, I didn't hesitate. I took it. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't ask for approval. I just signed my name, the same way I used to sign permission slips for the children who now saw me as disposable. That signature, the same one that built their childhood, became the one that decided their future. When they walked into my office that day, I didn't see family anymore. I saw people who had taught me the hardest lesson about love. I saw faces that once smiled at me in childhood photos, now pale with guilt and disbelief. And for a moment, I felt sorry for them. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I realized how much they had lost. Not money, not opportunity, but integrity. They had traded their conscience for convenience. They had chosen comfort over care. They had given up the chance to stand beside me when I needed them most, and in return, they lost the right to stand beside me when I finally stood tall again. When their keys didn't open the doors they once ignored, it wasn't cruelty, it was consequence. I didn't destroy them. I simply showed them the reflection they had been avoiding. They saw me not as a frail old woman, but as someone who built her own redemption inside the very walls they abandoned her in. Sometimes people think strength means shouting louder or fighting harder. It doesn't. Strength is sitting in silence while others underestimate you and letting time reveal who you really are. Strength is being kind when you have every reason not to be. It's keeping your calm when others panic, keeping your head high when others look away. That's what I did. I didn't argue, I didn't beg, and I didn't curse them. I just built myself back up. And when they finally came back, expecting the same helpless woman they left behind, they met someone entirely new, someone who didn't need their approval or their visits anymore. I didn't want apologies. I didn't need them. Because the truth is, forgiveness isn't for them, it's for me. It's the line that separates what they did from what I became. Now, when I walk through the halls of this home, I no longer feel abandoned. The residents greet me with smiles, the staff respect me, and the walls that once felt like a cage now feel like a crown. Every decision I make helps someone who truly needs it. Every policy I sign makes this place kinder, fairer, safer, the opposite of what my own family gave me. And sometimes, when I see new families come through the door to visit their parents, I wonder if my children ever think about me when they see them. I hope they do. I hope they remember the day they sat across from me and couldn't speak. I hope they remember the day they learned that neglect doesn't erase value and abandonment doesn't kill strength. They left me here thinking they buried me. Instead, I grew roots. I became the foundation they'll always have to walk on to reach anywhere higher. In the end, they taught me the most important truth. Family isn't who leaves you, it's who stays when everyone else walks away. And this time, I stayed for myself.